Welcome, everyone, to the Alexander Lecture in English Literature here at the Paul Cadario Conference Center. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I'm the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in the study of language variation and change. Let us come together in a good way. With our intellectual curiosity, openness to new ideas, and with a common goal to learn more today about a unique combination of art and philosophy created from traditional Indigenous stories, literature, earth, stone, and mirrors. But before we delve into this riveting landscape, I would like to begin with where we are. Let's take a moment to reflect together on the fact that for thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. It remains a vibrant meeting place for Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are honored to have the opportunity to work here with appreciation for the Indigenous heritage and culture in our midst. I'd like to point out in this regard the Seabing Indigenous landscape on the east side of the college building. This lovely garden is named for the ancient creek that once passed through these grounds. Seabing means river in Anishinaabe. The Alexander Lecture in English Literature was founded in 1928 in memory of Professor W.J. Alexander, who was head of the Department of English at University College from 1889 to 1925. In his inaugural lecture, Professor Alexander defined the study of literature as a work of interpretation and recognized that, and I quote, "the production of emotion is the object of the highest forms of literature." In this regard, we are extremely happy to have Warren Cariou here with us today. He is a professor in the Department of English, Theatre, and Media at the University of Manitoba. He is a true Canadian of the North with Métis and European heritage. He was born in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, which is probably farther north than most of us have ever been, about halfway up the province of Saskatchewan. I say this because where we come from inevitably influences how we view the world around us. And in Warren's case, it is a poignant focus on the cultural and environmental issues of the landscape. Before we introduce Professor Cariou, I want to give you some quick housekeeping notes. We have people in the room and we have people online tonight. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the question and answer period of today's lecture. Please raise your hand to ask a question once the lecture concludes. Please speak into the microphone rather than speaking without one in order for our audience at home to hear your questions. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Zoom chat function to submit your online questions. I now call upon Larissa Lai to introduce our distinguished speaker from a disciplinary perspective. Professor Lai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tagliamonte. It's really wonderful to see everyone here tonight. And Warren, I'm so happy that you're here. So happy. Hi, everyone. My name is Larissa Lai. I'm a Hong Kong Chinese by way of Kumeyaay, Beothuk, Coast Salish, and Treaty 7 territories. A true honor and pleasure to be here on the Dish with One Spoon. I would like to express my greatest gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of these lands. I'm new to these territories and still very much learning the protocols, but very honored to be here. It's a great honor and pleasure to be introducing Warren Cariou to you this afternoon. Dr. Cariou is a writer, photographer, and professor based in Winnipeg. I've had the good fortune of knowing him, I think, since the late 90s. I think it's that long. When I met him at a large and crowded arts event in Regina when I was visiting for a writers' union AGM. And I remember the room was packed and so noisy, and it was hard to talk, leave really engaged with any other attendee while alone. But his greeting was warm and so engaged and interested. And since then, I've known him to be a person for whom making sincere and meaningful connections that deepen our understanding of each other and our places in the world as a serious commitment. He's been a generous and astute supporter of me and my work for many years, someone I've turned to for advice, feedback, and support on so many issues I can't name them all. And more than that, I know he's done so for many people. Dr. Cariou has worked in numerous media, including photography, memoir, fiction, poetry, and film. He's also edited many books of Indigenous literature and storytelling, most recently an important update on Greg Young-Ing's Elements of Indigenous Style. His work with the Omishkego elder Louis Bird has been so important, both for the ways that it keeps Indigenous storytelling practices alive and in the forefront of public consciousness, and also for his generous and ethical demonstration of how one goes about building good relationships with elders. His essay on critical humility has been helpful for many scholars, writers, artists, and activists, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for showing us ways of being in knowledge and community that are collective, generous, and community-oriented. His work focuses on the environmental philosophies and oral traditions of Indigenous peoples in Western Canada, especially in connection to his Red River Métis heritage. His films and his bitumen photographs, which I believe he's going to talk about today, document the experience of Indigenous communities in the Athabasca tar sands region near his home community of Meadow Lake in Saskatchewan. It strikes me that there's something so interesting about using contested land-rooted material to critique rather than perpetuate the commercial purposes to which it has usually been put. It is a form of land respect and land speaking, or what Dr. Cariou calls terra story. I just learned that this morning. Not beyond the human, but through human involvement and complication. There's an ethics at work here, as in all of his work, that is complex and open to other futures beyond the rather frightening one that seems to be staring us in the face at present. I find this deeply inspiring. It offers a powerful alternative to the polarizing ethics that have marked politics on both the left and the right of late. I'm so delighted that he is here, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. Would you please welcome Dr. Warren Cariou?
Thank you so much, Larissa, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Sally and to everyone here at University College who has made my visit possible. And also want to thank you for the acknowledgements of the Indigenous peoples of this territory, and which I want to echo. And I also want to add one other acknowledgement to the people that whom Leanne Simpson calls the unceded nation under the gardener. When I lived here in Toronto, the Indigenous people that I met were often living rough, and I think that's still the case now. I want special thanks to Sally, to Abigail, to Larissa, and to Tyler for all that they've done to make me feel welcome here. I'm just blessed to be here, and really looking forward to sharing some of this work and hopefully having a conversation with you about it as well. The part one of this presentation is Masinapaskisahu. Pardon me, Masinapiskahu. Knew I was going to mistake that one. The translation of this from Cree is, they make marks on rocks, but it also is, they take photographs. So before I begin in the presentation itself, I want to just take a minute to situate myself in relation to my home and my work. I'm a Red River Métis citizen, and I have family ties in the homeland of the Métis Nation in the Red River Valley, that is Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and where I live and I teach at the University of Manitoba. My Métis kin networks on my father's side of the family include the Hamlin, Lorentz, Vandal, and Beaulieu de Sinclair families. And my mother's side of the family is of German and Norwegian roots. I grew up in Treaty 6 territory in a community called Meadow Lake, as was just mentioned, which is near the Alberta border and is located in the acid rain shadow of the Athabasca tar sands. Much of my work has been focused on my home community and the Cree Métis storytelling traditions I first encountered there, as well as the environmental, cultural, and economic effects of tar sand mining upon Indigenous communities. That is the subject that I want to focus on today, but returning here to the University of Toronto brings me back to the other research that I did at the beginning of my graduate career. I began my MA studies in the English department here in 1990, and I returned in 1993 to do a PhD under the very capable and generous supervision of Professor Alan Buell. You might be surprised to learn that my dissertation was not on Indigenous literature, which was not really possible to do at that time, but in fact, it was on Romanticism, and specifically on William Blake's poetry and art. I was fascinated by Blake's relationship to the medium he invented, an engraving process that he called illuminated printing. And in my dissertation, I studied the metaphoric and embodied aspects of this relationship throughout Blake's later work. Soon after finishing the dissertation, I turned toward a subject closer to my own lived experience as a Métis person, and I began to do the work on Indigenous literature, oral stories, and environmental politics that has been my focus for a quarter of a century now. However, my early work on Blake has continued to resonate for me throughout my career, and it has particularly influenced my thinking on the subject I'll be discussing today. In my attempts to understand the scale and pervasiveness of tar sands mining in the Athabasca region, as well as its global effects, I've turned to many different genres and media, as Larissa mentioned, including film, academic articles, stories, and poems. I've felt a restlessness in this work because each of my attempts to understand and portray the effects of bitumen mining has seemed insufficient in comparison to the magnitude of the extractive industry there and the multifaceted nature of its threats. Athabasca bitumen mining has been called the largest industrial project on Earth, and it involves a radical disruption of the Earth's surface over vast areas. It is also a massive contributor to CO2 emissions and many other forms of pollution in the air, water, and soil. What is perhaps less well known is that bitumen mining also has devastating cultural, health, and economic effects upon the Indigenous communities of the region, including my own. Eventually, over the course of my time spent near Fort McMurray and in Indigenous communities such as Fort Chipewyan and Fort Mackay, I began to engage with the material presence of the bitumen itself, which is not only visible in the gigantic strip mines that scar the land in shocking proximity to Indigenous communities, but also in naturally occurring sites along the Athabasca River, where it has always been there on the land for those who know how to look for it. So here is probably an image that you will recognize of the strip mining process that is done over vast areas in the Athabasca region. Here's a tailing pond in where you can see the thick buildup of the remnants of the bitumen in that tailings pond. Here in 2008, I was making a film called Land of Oil and Water about indigenous communities in this region, including in my own community. And as we were walking on the road beside the Fort Mackay First Nation band office, this is literally 100 steps from the band office, there was a rock lying there on the ground, and I picked it up and I smelled it, and it was bitumen. You could tell by the smell. So this was the first time that I touched the bitumen and smelled it and recognized that it's natural too. We think of it as being only the hideous scarred landscape, but in fact, it naturally occurs on the surface of the earth, and it's a very different experience when you find it there. And when I was there, I heard stories in both the Fort Mackay First Nation and Métis Nation of traditional practices where people would gather bitumen from these natural sources and use it for sealing their canoes and other vessels. And I wondered if there could be other uses for bitumen in the contemporary world, if this material could be diverted out of its all too common extractive trajectory and toward a creative and generative goal. I came up with the idea of experimenting with Athabasca bitumen as a medium for photography, hearkening back to Nicephore Niepce's 1826 creation of what is now known as the first photograph, using a substance called bitumen of Judea. Looking back now, I can see that this was in some ways a natural connection for me to make because Niepce was a contemporary of William Blake, and Niepce's early heliography experiments were directed toward the invention of a new printing process, much like Blake's radical experiments to create a new medium of illuminated printing. I thought it would be interesting to recreate Niepce's photographic practice, but to use Athabasca bitumen as a way of viewing the world through petroleum. Thus, I chose to call this practice petrography. One of the things that intrigued me about the possibility of making photographs with Athabasca bitumen was the particular kind of representation that this might enable. In a petrograph, I hoped or imagined that the tar might reveal certain aspects of itself through its material presence, as well as through the indexical representation of the image on the tar. Perhaps I can express this desire best or explain it by showing an image that I was later able to produce. This is the one that we started this slideshow with, really. This is called Bitumen Mine Crossroads. And the indexical part of it is the representation of a tar sands mine. This is a massive exposed strip mine. And it's hard to get a sense of the scale of this, but you see there's a tiny speck, like an ant, basically in the middle lower third of the image. That's a gigantic truck that's about the size of this room. So what I was hoping for is, I think, sort of worked out in this image, in that the image is bitumen. It is made of bitumen that I gathered from the land, but what is being represented is also the same material. So I liked that connection, the embodied presence of the material in the representation. And I had that idea. I didn't know if it was going to work, but as it turned out, it did in ways that I wasn't really expecting. So at the time when I was making these plans, my intentions were very vague. I had really no intention of becoming a visual artist. It sort of happened by accident because these experiments started to work. I had instead a vague hunch that it would be interesting to see what Athabasca bitumen could reveal about tar sands mining. And throughout the process of this work on oil and on its relationship to indigenous ways of knowing, I've actually had to rely on other people's expertise because I'm sort of working by intuition. And so learning from people in various fields and from elders and community members has been crucial to this project. One of the people that I have learned a lot from in terms of photographic history and in terms of understanding what it was I was actually trying to do is art historian Siobhan Angus, who is a recent PhD graduate from U of T in art history. She's now a new assistant professor at Carleton. And from what I understand, she actually worked here at University College for some time when she was at U of T, so maybe some of you know her. Her work, including her brilliant new book, Camera Geologica, an elemental history of photography, has been crucial in helping me to understand the material, historical, and ethical contexts of my own petrography project. In Camera Geologica, Angus writes that petrography suggests, quote, reorientation of vision, end quote, in the definition of photography, from the pervasive emphasis on light to an emphasis on the physical mind materials that are the basis of all photographic representation, including silver for film photography and rare earth metals for digital photography. To paraphrase, Angus argues for a shift of emphasis in our conception of photography from light writing to stone writing. Camera geologica is an investigation of the geological basis of all forms of photography, and so the role of extractivism, colonization, and capitalism in the production of these geological image-making surfaces. This idea of stone writing resonates for me in a number of ways. While my initial naming of petrography was a gesture toward the petroleum basis of my bitumen medium, the word petroleum itself, of course, literally means rock oil. And thus the term petrography is perhaps more accurately understood in a broader way as writing with stone or writing by stone. However, I propose to use the term petromimesis to mean the broader representational capacity of stone, including petroleum, but also all other geological materials. Mimesis, meaning imitation or representation, moves the metaphor a little further away from the anthropocentric associations and intentions connoted by the word graph. In relation to Siobhan Angus's work, petromimesis would encompass the silver halide particles in a film emulsion or the potassium ferrocyanide particles in a cyanotype, for example. In many cases, petromimesis is initiated through certain kinds of human intervention, such as the creation of a particular photosensitive compound and the exposure of that material to a specific amount of focused light. On a much larger scale, however, it could be said that human extraction and burning of fossil fuels has created a situation where atmospheric CO2 is creating climate conditions that inscribe the surface of the Earth. That is essentially the most basic definition of the word Anthropocene, humans making marks on rocks. It's also essentially what I do when I make a petrograph. However, petromimesis, as I'm thinking of it, also includes situations when, even without human intervention, stone creates what humans might experience as representations. I'm thinking here of certain natural rock formations, fossils, and radioactivity, but also more spiritual understandings of the liveness of, and agency of stone that present the possibility of geological materials telling us something. A significant focus of my discussion today is directed toward considering how petroleum represents, but I don't want to limit the argument to petroleum because I think it needs to be understood alongside its fellow geological materials, to be replaced in the earthy context from which it has been so often and so violently extracted. We pichichu, dirty hands. In my initial conception of petrography, I was intrigued by the idea of petroleum as a medium of representation, as I mentioned, particularly a medium that could be utilized to reveal what some humans are doing to the earth with petroleum. I was also interested in the physical presence of the bitumen that I had seen on the ground in the Fort McKay First Nation, and I was struck by the incongruity between those redolent but generally innocuous seeming black stones and the massive destruction that has been wrought by oil companies that mine, refine, and distribute that same material. What I didn't really consider at the beginning of this work was that I would end up having a complicated relationship with bitumen as part of my petrography process, and that the materiality of the bitumen would leave traces on and with me as well. At the beginning, I thought of it more as an adventure, a reason to spend time on the Athabasca River, and another new way of assuaging my seemingly unbounded restlessness regarding the scale and significance of the tar sands. Not really believing that this plan to make bitumen photographs would work, I set out to find the right kind of tar for the task. This involved traveling along the Athabasca in the summer, looking for natural seeps, where I'd been told the bitumen came to the surface on hot days. I had encountered that harder rock-like form of bitumen in numerous places, but I quickly found that it was not suitable for my purpose because it would not dissolve in the lavender oil that I used as a thinning agent, which is what Niepce himself had used. It took a while to recognize what the softer bitumen seeps looked like and what kind of topography they would most likely be found in, but eventually I stumbled upon the place where I would source the bitumen for many of my first petrographs. I had traveled on a boat with my research assistants through the seemingly endless devastation of the bitumen mines, but then we turned up a tributary and soon found this place, where an undisturbed seam of bitumen had been exposed by natural erosion. I was amazed by the contrast with the hellscape we had just passed through. Gone were the headache-inducing smells, the sounds of grinding machinery, the clouds of smoke, the excoriated land. The exposed natural bitumen hillside and the rest of the place had a kind of quiet beauty. At the foot of the hill, a small rivulet of water flowed over a dark, glossy substrate, and I knew immediately from its appearance and its smell that this was the tar I was seeking. I was so excited to find it that without thinking, I knelt down and reached my open palm into the surface. I wanted to feel it, to immerse myself in it. And of course, as I should have expected, the tar stuck to me with extraordinary tenacity. During the 2 or 3 hours we spent at that site, I, the photographer who had raised funds to go to this place, was not able to take any photographs because this tar was stuck to my hand and I couldn't grab my camera. The tar would not rub off. I rubbed it on the grass, I rubbed it on the leaves of the nearby poplar trees, which is probably not a respectful thing to do. I even sacrificed a lens cleaning cloth to try to wipe it off, and it would not come off. We had hired a boat driver to take us to this location, and he thought I was an idiot. And he wouldn't let me back in the boat until I cleaned this off my hand. He also had a suggestion of what I could use to get it off my hand: boat gas. So I swabbed my hand with 92 octane gasoline while the boat driver shook his head and inspected my progress. Eventually, most of the tar melted away and I was allowed back on the boat. But I was required to sit in the back so that no one else had to inhale my fumes on the way back to Fort McMurray. Even so, after the gasoline evaporated, my hand smelled like bitumen for days. And from that time on, the tar has clung to me. That first sample of bitumen became the basis of my petrography experiments. And in the course of creating my petrographs over the years, that tar has stuck to my hands many times. It's gotten in my hair. It's permanently stained my clothes. And it has also made its way inside my body in its airborne form, which is released most powerfully when I heat the bitumen up to 300 degrees in order to solidify the photographic emulsion for an image. I have learned to take precautions to protect myself from these bitumen vapors. But still, I sometimes experience headaches and irritability after a long session of working on petrographs. The bitumen has become part of me, physically as well as intellectually and aesthetically. Essentially, what I've been doing throughout this decade-long process is developing a relationship with this material. Its toxicity is part of that relationship. And sometimes I think that the bitumen is communicating to me through the physical effects it has on my body. The tar is perhaps telling me that it requires respect, that if I'm going to work with it, I need to find the parameters in which that work will be safe and also productive. But certainly, it's not only the bitumen's pungent physical presence that is interacting with me when I'm trying to create a petrograph. In aesthetic terms, as well as embodied ones, the whole enterprise is a negotiation, a reciprocal interaction. I learned very early on in my petrography experiments that I was collaborating with this medium, and also at times struggling against its own tendencies, trying to make it signify in ways that I intended. I came to realize that I couldn't master the tar. I could only go so far with my plans before the tar's nature made my intentions moot. And this negotiation I've had with the strengths and the refusals of the tar is perhaps analogous to the situation of everyone in the petromodern age. All of us, to varying degrees, collaborate with petroleum and struggle against its particular tendencies. And we also suffer bodily and otherwise from the effects of using and misusing it. As you can already see by the way I've been referring to my bitumen here, I started to think of it as a semi-agential entity, which was contributing to the petrography process in ways that I couldn't control. The tar, as I imagined it, wanted to do certain things and not other things. I found myself asking, what does this tar want? How does it want to present this image? Or does it want to do this at all? When an image didn't turn out the way I intended it to, or when it was hard to discern on the mirrored surface of the polished metal plate, I started to ascribe this to the tar's agency. I thought, this is what the tar wants to reveal and how it wants to do the revealing. Eventually, I decided that I had to accept these aspects of the medium and try to learn what they might mean, what the tar was trying to tell me. Asini Ichimuna, Stone Stories. In my own Métis tradition and in many other indigenous cultures, the idea of stones being alive and holding wisdom is commonplace. In a 2019 conversation I had with Asiniskau Athiniwak, that is Rocky Cree, knowledge keeper William Dumas, he talked about how stones can tell stories. And he shared traditional knowledge about particular stones in his territory and the stories that were attached to them. There are so many examples of similar practices, such as the fact that fire-heated rocks used in a sweat lodge ceremony are often referred to as grandfathers. The idea that these are elders who are participating in the ceremony and are important in that ceremonial and spiritual role. Similarly, in the Anishinaabe ceremonial site known as Manitoba, groups of rocks that are sometimes called petroforms represent beings and characters from Anishinaabe oral culture and traditional knowledge. Here too, in Manitoba, there are grandfather stones that are given special respect and where people leave offerings and prayers. There are also other kinds of so-called rock art in many, if not all, Indigenous territories on Turtle Island, including petroglyphs and rock paintings. Clearly, these are created with the contribution of human agency, but if I'm not mistaken, there is also generally a sense that these stones themselves are holding particular knowledge or spiritual power, and that the inscription of the physical marks or the physical arrangement of the stones is a kind of collaboration rather than an operation of human intention upon an inert object. In naming my project Petrography, I was also thinking about these traditional indigenous forms of rock representation, petroglyphs and petroforms. Fossils are another form of what I'm calling Petromimesis, in which stone comes to hold the shape of a long dead organism. In this case, the representation is quite literal and material. The body of a living plant or animal is displaced by or reformed into minerals over an extremely long time. Petroleum is itself, of course, known as a fossil fuel, and it is made up of untold numbers of long dead but once alive organisms. In the form of oil or bitumen, these organisms no longer hold the shapes that they held when they were alive. But ancient deposits of tar have often been the sites of much later processes of fossilization. We see this in the La Brea tar pits with the famous saber-toothed tigers that are preserved there. We also see it in the Athabasca bitumen deposits, where strip mining periodically unearths large fossils, such as this nearly perfectly preserved Borealopelta fossil that was discovered in 2011. The oil companies don't like discovering these because it means they have to stop all of their activity as soon as they find one of these. The tar here is a means of creating this representation, a connection to deep time and a holder of these ancestral creatures. This kind of fossilization is also somewhat reminiscent of how a petrograph signifies, since the petrograph image is held in a suspension of bitumen that has been hardened by sunlight. Several Indigenous writers, including Richard Van Camp, Lesley Marmon Silko, Marie Clements, Jeanette Armstrong, and Jordan Abel, have explored the animacy and agency of stone in their work. And I wish I had much more time to examine this theme in more detail. Silko's Laguna community is located near the Jackpile uranium mine that was the source of nuclear research done on the Manhattan Project. And it's also close to the Trinity nuclear test sites. In Silko's novel Ceremony, uranium has clearly become a planetary threat due to its misuse, But on the other hand, a local deposit of uranium is also part of the protagonist Teo's healing journey. This stone embodies and expresses certain potentials that seem to be awakened, both destructive and healing, through the ways that humans relate to that stone. In Nishka writer Jordan Abel's new novel, Empty Spaces, the idea of geological agency is portrayed on a planetary scale in a highly unconventional narrative which contains no human or animal characters, but rather an incantatory interaction of rocks, water, plant matter, and bodies over a very long time. One could say that the main character of this novel is the Earth itself, since the narrative operates according to planetary rhythms, materials, and timescales. In Abel's foregrounding of geological processes and temporalities, human agency is de-emphasized, though humans do seem to be implicated in the gradual process of planetary dissolution that the book narrates. One other example of petromimesis in contemporary Indigenous art is Métis filmmaker Amanda Strong's short film, Bitumen, The Dawn Comes, which was, I think, a collaboration with Leanne Simpson. This film involves an artist named Bitumen and a 10,000-year-old Sasquatch known as Sabe, and they communicate by text message using these phones that are rocks. And when I saw that, I thought, that is what a phone is. It's just a rock that we communicate with. I want to shift the focus slightly now to talk about two theorists who have deeply influenced my thinking about how stone can act and can represent. Kathryn Yusoff's new book, Geologic Life, and her previous title, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, are both brilliant and multifaceted approaches to this subject. And they have provided me with a powerful conceptual apparatus to help me understand my own position in relation to bitumen. In A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, Yusoff argues that extractivism and the geological science that supports it, which she calls white geology, is essentially the same process as colonization and anti-Blackness. The connection she makes between violence against racialized bodies and violence against the land itself is persuasive, and it has far-reaching implications. It makes environmental racism suddenly come into focus in a new way for me, especially in terms of the threats to indigeneity that have arisen alongside the extractive zones that have proliferated across Indigenous territories through the last 2 centuries or more. Yusoff shows persuasively how white geology dehumanizes Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples and constructs them, us, as natural resources to be claimed, owned, and processed into profits. In Geologic Life, she argues against not only the geological dehumanization of BIPOC people, i.e., against the ideology that we are essentially like a seam of coal or an oil deposit, but she also resists the thingification of the Earth's crust, putting forward an idea of what she calls inhuman intimacy, which she sees BIPOC subjects having access to, and which she defines as an intimacy with the Earth that is unknown to the structural position of whiteness. This intimacy with the Earth is exactly what I have seen in many Indigenous philosophies and land-based practices that I have written about in other places, including a short article on Indigenous energy intimacy, as I called it. Yusoff's work is particularly valuable because she finds strength and resistance in this inhuman intimacy, and in the ways that this resistance can be activated through poetry and other arts. In both of her books, she returns to the work of Dionne Brand many times, and she finds a powerful expression of intimacy with stone in Brand's work. Discussing At the Full and Change of the Moon, she sees there, quote, a materiality that cuts through coloniality as a counter-aesthetic, a poetry of rocks that tells a different story of rocks. I take this as a challenge and an inspiration for other artists of inhuman intimacy. Yusoff's ideas have compelling parallels to Métis scholar Zoe Todd's understanding of bitumen as kin in her article, Fish, Kin, and Hope, Tending to Water Violations in Amisquachiwaskahigan Territory and Treaty 6 Territory, where she locates Athabasca bitumen within Métis kin networks, affirming that we as Métis are related to this material that occurs naturally on our homeland. Discussing the devastating 2016 Husky Energy oil spill of diluted bitumen in the Saskatchewan River, she writes, "The fossil fuels which animate the political economy of my home province are a paradoxical kind of kin. The bones of dinosaurs and the traces of flora and fauna from millions of years ago, which surface in rocks and loamy earth in Alberta, act as teachers for us, reminding us of the life that once teemed here. But the insatiable desire to liberate these long-gone beings from their resting place, to turn the massive stores of carbon and hydrogen left from eons of life in this place, weaponizes these fossil kin, these long-dead beings, and transforms them into threats to our very existence." I find this an affecting and persuasive account of how the destructive agency of petroleum in the contemporary world can be understood relationally, in connection to Métis teachings of Wakotuen, which Todd elsewhere defines as the relatedness of all things in existence. So a notion of kinship with all things, including the earth. Here, the problem posed by extractivism is understood as a failure of relations, an evasion of the responsibilities that kinship entails. As Yusoff argues, extractive ideology denies the liveness of its objects, whether they are bodies or animal or minerals, and thus the possibility of relationship is foreclosed. But if the geological materials are acknowledged to be alive, then an entirely different ethic becomes imperative. Todd asks, what does it mean to approach carbon and fossil beings, including those spilled into Saskatchewan Sippy, the Saskatchewan River, as agential and more than human beings in their own right? It means, I believe, that we are called to renegotiate the relationship we have with these beings, to repair it before we are too late. Another way of saying this is that we are called to make treaty with our weaponized kin. With this in mind, I've been writing a poem about the concept of tar treaty that is inspired by Todd's challenge to imagine how we can de-weaponize our fossil kin, and inspired also by Yusoff's call for a poetry of rocks to tell the story of rocks. Unfortunately, I couldn't finish the poem in time for this presentation. I write one poem per year and the year's not up yet. I don't have the full poem. And in fact, I'm very conscious that there are amazing poets in this room. So this is only my beginning attempt at a poem. But I want to just read this excerpt from a to be continued poem called Tar Treaty. It was time for an adhesion, nearly everyone agreed, especially the tar. They wanted nothing more. Their job had always been to hold things together. Rocks and sand, canoes, bones, the generations. They were the reminder of old life, the one who stayed put, the one who clung to time. Thick meniscus of planetary memory now spread thin, forced to do things they didn't understand. Their work had become impossible. So the tar sent out its invitations, first in small dark rafts of themselves that floated down the river on the hottest days, then stuck to the mandibles of ants, the quivery arms of bacteria. The winds carried it as smoke, and poplars took up the message, relayed it root to root. Whitefish swam upstream, invitations tucked in their swim bladders. Weekes whispered it to muskrat, who shared it with all the water relatives. Wild roses broadcast it with their scent, sweetgrass and wild mint too, until the air and the water and the land echoed with the call to treaty. Even the two-leggeds received it, deep in their padded bodies, chromosomal signals flaring, radio waves ajitter, viscous syllables stuck on their tongues of fire and flood. Wasapiska Nimawu. They flash signals with a mirror. In this final section, I want to discuss what I initially considered a flaw or weakness of petrographs, the fact that they are essentially petroleum-based mirrors that reflect the viewer and their surroundings, as well as the photographic image. And I have a petrograph in the front there, and you'll probably have a sense that there's nothing on that image. because it's difficult to see. And I invite you to come up afterward and look at it in different light, and you'll hopefully be able to see the image on it. But that was the problem. One of the problems that this medium presented to me is that it's very reflective. So I tried to fix that. I tried to make the petrographs, the image, more legible by creating them on a matte surface of metal rather than on the highly reflective one like what Niepce had done. But as soon as I did that, the image disappeared. So eventually I realized that, like in Niepce's first photograph, the reflective surface was necessary to the image, even though this also meant that the presence of reflections would make the viewing experience more cluttered and potentially confusing. Eventually, I decided that this was one of the bitumen's contributions to the representational surface of the petrograph, which made me ponder what this reflectivity might mean, what the tar might be trying to say by refusing to let me see the image without also seeing a reflection of myself. That gives you a bit of an example of how reflective those are. I'm just going to go back because that's going to be very annoying if that keeps repeating. Before the photograph, there was the mirror. I want to consider the mirror alongside the photograph as another kind of geological representational surface, because mirrors are almost always constructed of polished metal or stone that has been mined from the Earth's crust. The ancient Egyptians, for example, had polished bronze mirrors, and the Aztecs created black mirrors of gleaming obsidian, while the more quotidian mirrors of Western modernity are generally made with what is known as a tane, or thin coating of tin or silver on the back of a sheet of glass, i.e. melted sand. One fascinating recent variation on the geological mirror is Austrian artist Ernst Logar's work, Reflecting Oil, in which the tane of the mirror is a sealed container of liquid crude oil. Logar's work is an invitation for viewers to contemplate the petromodern self, to ponder their relationship to oil as both a medium of representation and as a fuel that underpins many aspects of their lives. I have been fascinated by mirrors since long before I became a photographer. One of my dissertation chapters was actually on William Blake's metaphorical and literal use of mirrors in his poetry and his illuminated printing, which he famously had to inscribe in laterally inverted mirror writing to create these copper plates. For Blake, as for countless other artists and thinkers in the Western tradition and beyond, the mirror is the quintessential symbol of representation itself. The ways in which mirrors are deployed or depicted can reflect a wide range of symbolic associations regarding what representation can do and what it should do. In the Western tradition, mirrors can symbolize truth, falsehood, distortion, epiphenomena, moral improvement, vanity, and of course for Lacan, the mirror is the medium upon which subjectivity is negotiated. Indigenous peoples have long had different uses for the mirror, different understandings of how it signifies, and even the kind of subjectivity that it presents. To make my point, I want to tell you about a brief mirror story that I learned from Omushkigo Cree elder Louis Bird, whom I've worked with for many years. Here's a picture of Louis, who is every bit as generous and fun to be around as that picture makes him seem. This was not an Ateoguin or traditional Cree story, but rather a Wawiyetuin, which is a joke. Louis told it when he was asked in a very serious context what the impact of the fur trade had been on his community. His community is Winisk, Pewanak, Ontario. He considered for quite a while, and finally he started telling us the story, which we didn't know was a joke at the time, about a Cree man and his wife, way back at the beginning of the fur trade. This man was a very good hunter and trapper, and the Hudson Bay Company factor came to him and said, if you bring in more furs than anyone else, at the end of the season, I'll give you a gift, a special reward that you will always treasure. So the man worked very hard. He got so many animals he trapped, he hunted, he brought the furs all year, and finally at the end of the season, the factor came to him and he said, you've done it. You really are the best. And here is your reward. But first, before I give you the reward, you have to remember, only look at this when you're alone. That's the most important thing. And here it is, enjoy. And so the man took his reward, went off by himself. He unwrapped it. And when he looked into it, he was amazed at what he saw there, himself, his own face. And he was so taken with this reward that he ended up looking into it all the time, making faces, smiling to himself, and he was just so happy to see himself in this surface. Well, eventually, his wife noticed that he was doing something strange, off by himself, looking into a surface and smiling. And eventually, she started to get jealous. Maybe that's a picture of a woman, she thought. So now in this community, there was a rule, as Louis explained, that a woman should never look into a man's private things. And this man had been keeping his mirror in his private box. So one day, her husband went out hunting, and she decided, I'm going to break that rule. I'm going to go and look in there and see what it is. Because if I ever find out who that woman is, I'm going to kill her. That's what she said. So she snuck in there, she opened the box, and she saw there was a wrapping. She unwrapped the covering on it, and she gazed down at the image, and then a look of relief and elation comes onto her face. Oh, she's very ugly, she says. And that, Louis Bird said, is the impact of the fur trade. So, at first, this joke might be seen to be portraying Cree people as naifs who don't understand the Western technology of the mirror. But the fact that the story circulates in a Cree community and that Cree people laugh at it suggested to me a different possibility, that it is in fact using humor to teach by negative example, as so many Cree oral stories and other Indigenous oral stories do. I find it to be, in fact, a powerful critique of the psychological and relational damage caused by the first extractive industry brought to Turtle Island from Europe, the fur trade. An industry that commodified the bodies of wild animals, characterizing them as natural resources similar to what Yusoff identifies as white geology. The fur trade also distorted the traditional hunting practices of Indigenous peoples who were co-opted into capitalism at the same time as they were enlisted in what might be seen as ecosystem warfare, radically changing the environment by depleting certain animals. And Louis talks about that and how that had a generational effect, the loss of certain animals in their territory. So the mirror here is a symbol of colonial indoctrination, in my mind. The HBC factor instructs the trapper on how to use the mirror, but that particular instruction is clearly teaching him to be prideful and selfish. He becomes enamored of himself and forgets the crucial teachings of Peweyemoen, humility. And this selfishness leads to his wife's suspicion and then her transgression of the Cree law that she should not look in her husband's private affairs. Her own misrecognition at the end of the story might be a sign of how much she too has been changed by the arrival of the fur trade. We should note that the woman is not actually naive about European technologies. She mistakes the mirror for a photograph, after all. She expects one kind of representation on the surface of this shiny, flat object, but is faced with a different kind of representation. And therein lies her misrecognition. The underlying message of this story, I think, is that these two Cree characters both make a fundamental mistake when they start to treat the mirror as a representation of the individual and of hierarchy, placing oneself above others. The man has been introduced to Western individualism and the idea that he is better than others, which he is encouraged to prove by killing far more animals than he needs. While the woman is happy to judge that her putative rival is very ugly, meaning that the woman imagines herself to be superior. The result is that their cultural understanding of the mirror and its representations has been disrupted, and so has their relationship. I think the humor in this story for a Cree audience is not that the couple don't know what a mirror is, but that they are using it in the wrong way, a way that goes against the values of humility, generosity, and equality that are so important in Cree teachings. In fact, Indigenous people have used mirrors in their own unique ways since mirrors became adopted by Indigenous peoples in different times for different communities. But we can see this, for example, in this Anishinaabe woman's cape or overdress that is in the National Museum of the American Indian, which is adorned with small mirrors. And this kind of adornment is still commonly practiced on powwow regalia today. And obviously these mirrors are not meant to be gazed into for the purpose of self-reflection or inspection. Instead, they reflect light outward, creating flashes of brilliance that attract the attention of others. This brings to mind another use of mirrors among Indigenous hunters and trappers during the fur trade and later, which is to send signals by flashing sunlight in particular directions. I was fascinated to learn that there is a Cree word meaning they signal with a mirror, wasapiskanimawu, as I mentioned at the beginning of this section. This also reminds me of a scene in Anishinaabe writer Wabgishig Rice's post-apocalyptic novel, Moon of the Turning Leaves, which is set in a time after all the electrical grids have failed. A group of Anishinaabe find a dead cell phone that one of their kin has propped in a tree at a certain angle to act as a signaling device reflecting sunshine, a black mirror that functions to direct these relatives toward a place of safety. And this brings me to one more example of the mirror as adornment, and potentially also a signaling device, which is this Hudson's Bay Company mirror that has been adapted to a gorget. And this is dating from between 1780 and 1820. The HBC created forms of what they called trade silver at this time, which were used as a form of payment and or reward for productive Indigenous trappers. And some of this trade silver took the form of mirrors, which were the most highly valued of them. And so we can see that Louis Bird's mirror story has a clear basis in fur trade history. But this gorget mirror also tells us something that Louis Bird's mirror story doesn't explicitly mention, possibly because he assumed his audience would know this. The way that the owner has adapted this trade mirror into a gorget shows that the mirror can be used differently from the way that the Westerners use it and from the way that the factor told this hunter to use it. Rather than gazing into it when you're by yourself, that the mirror could be worn, that it could be directed outward. And I'm really interested in the symbolism of that shift and its implications for the representational capacity of the mirror and possibly the representational capacity of petromimesis more generally. If the mirror image is a Western symbol that we associate with the individual and vanity, then what does it mean to turn that mirror the other way, to reflect the world around you and even the people who approach you? If you wear the mirror, you don't see your own body in it, but you present part of your body as a mobile screen of representation. You reflect others to themselves and to one another. This embodies a kind of relationality that I associate with the teachings of Wahkotowen. Leanne Simpson raises this relational potential of the mirror in a review that she did of Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus and Glenn Coulthard's Red Skin, White Masks. Here's one other slide of the mirror. But here's the quotation from Leanne Simpson. Let's talk about how relationality plays out in Indigenous contexts. Part of being in a meaningful relationship with another being is recognizing who they are. It is reflecting back to them their essence and worth as a being. It is a mirroring. Positive mirroring creates positive identities. It creates strong, grounded individuals and families and nations within Indigenous political systems. So at the same time I am looking into the mirror, I also am the mirror. What do I mirror back to my kin? Dysfunction, criticism, cynicism? What do these two books mirror back to Dene and Haudenosaunee peoples? That's easy. They mirror back strength, pride, connection, beauty, love, fierceness, courage, bravery, and all the very best parts of being Dene or Haudenosaunee. I love Simpson's insight into the relational possibilities of mirror representation in her shift from noun to verb here, from the mirror to the act of mirroring. When she writes, at the same time I am looking into the mirror, I also am the mirror, This is a move toward reciprocity and toward understanding the self as only one part of a network of relations that we understand as Wahkotoan. Before I close this afternoon, I want to return to the tar-coated mirror of the petrograph, which, as I said, I initially imagined as a problem of representation because it didn't allow my intended image to be seen as clearly as photographs today are usually seen. But now I've realized that this aspect of the petrograph actually provides an opportunity of representation because it enables a different form of reflective inhuman intimacy. You may have noticed today that I'm wearing something that you probably can't see from there. I'm going to show you a slide of it so you can look more closely, or come up and see me shortly and you can look. Thinking about Simpson's commentary on mirroring, it prompted me to try something new with a petrograph, to turn it the other way around and wear it like the mirror gorget the Cree and Métis trappers wore during the fur trade and afterward. In honor of Zoe Todd and her work on fish, kin, and bitumen, this petrograph is an image of a fish, a particular fish, a walleye that I caught a few years ago and that my family and I consumed soon after it was caught. By wearing this image and directing it toward each of you, I hope that I'm communicating something about our shared community here today, and about our kinship with one another, but also our kinship with this material that has made possible various wonders, but that is also inscribing untold damage onto the world and onto the bodies that live here. In representing this carbon kinship that we share, I hope this little petrograph also reminds us that kinship involves reciprocal responsibilities, and that the work of de-weaponizing our kin is a work of mirroring toward one another and toward all of our relations. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring talk, Professor Cariou. And now would like to welcome Professor Tyler Pennock from the Center for Indigenous Studies, who will be moderating our live Q&A session, for which we roughly have about 20 minutes.
He's live, yep. Here we go.
So many things to say. So many. I've met Louis Bird, and so I can just, I'd like to be like him a little bit right now. You notice that it's anamorphic? The fact that you have to be at a certain angle to see the actual image?
Absolutely, yes. It is so dependent on your position. So it's about positionality, really. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and then it consistently shows you other also angles. It's very, yeah. Earlier, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I that's one of the things that I've actually found is actually interesting about it rather than a problem as I initially thought of it. It allows you to see not only yourself, but your surroundings. And so as a listener, or pardon me, as a viewer, you are implicated in that. And so I find that the tar was helping me to learn that, I guess, in a way.
Around the time when you were talking about trying to make the tar work in a way, and I believe the image of the tar coming out of the earth itself. My first thought was coexistence, the way that the earth manages to hold the tar without harm. Do you maybe want to talk a bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. In fact, these spaces where I've gathered the bitumen in this natural habitat, if you call it that, they're beautiful. And these photographs, indicate that a little bit. It's supporting life. Like plants are growing right out of this material. So we have this idea from viewing mine landscapes that it's toxic and deadly and anathema to life. That's totally not true. It's what humans have done to it that have made those hellscapes, right? So yeah, it's actually very much a part of the landscape and a part of the ecosystem. And so that's also something that I've really learned about how beautiful the places are where it is. So that's wonderful. When I go to those places, I'm always though also thinking about when will an oil company come here? So it's that threat that is there for the material when it's visible on the surface like that.
And if there's any questions at any time, otherwise I'll just keep asking them. The other thing that was interesting is I got the distinct impression that you next to the land, because in that image, it's very tall and there's trees and whatnot. And then seeing like the incompatibility we have with the land, with trying to do what the land can do. And after thousands of years, the land creates, for example, images of what I thought was an Ankylosaurus. But yeah, more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it, is trying to, not make the land do what it doesn't want to do, maybe is what I've sort of learned in a sense by using this material. And recognizing that, the Earth is operating on just such an incredibly different time scale from what we as humans are as well. It just, I think, brings really to bear that teaching of pewemuen, of humility, seeing how small we are in relation to all of this creation, and yet at the same time how our activity can threaten it. But yeah, I think there's so much, like just thinking about the layer of time and the layering of stories in land, because in Indigenous teachings, stories are held in the land. They're held in location, as we were talking about earlier. And so I think, digging into the surface is like that. You're finding these stories that are there, and that's when I go out on the land, going to look for bitumen, or where I'm just going out on the land for other reasons. I'm trying to think about that. What stories are here that I could maybe learn to attune my ear to.
There's a question in the audience. Yeah, we'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, including so many beautiful images. And my question is really about the beautiful images and beauty and aesthetics. Do you, because you're not only representing the beautiful images of petroleum in the landscape before it's turned into industrial sites, but your very first image, I think it was called Petroland, is of this devastated landscape, and it's an exquisitely beautiful image. And I was thinking a little bit about, for example, Impressionist painters were criticized for aestheticizing the pollution in London in the 19th century. And do you think there's a problem, or is it complicated, this idea of aestheticizing not just the, things as they occur in, or the naturally occurring petroleum, but the actual industrial processing of it all? Is there something about the aesthetic there that's complicated?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And when I first started producing petrographs, I was quite, I got to admit, dismayed by the aesthetic qualities that they had. I was sort of shocked that they were, beautiful in a way that I had not expected, because I wanted this to be about showing the ugliness of what humans are doing to that land. But I guess this is the way that it wants to be represented, in a sense. And so I'm not quite sure how to navigate that in some ways. I do also, though, I guess, if you get a chance to come up and look at this image here, example of a petrograph that I've got here, from some angles, I find it is ugly. So it's only certain angles when the light catches the image in a certain way that maybe it will have that aesthetic quality. When I make the images for the slides, I have to photograph the petrograph, and I have to hold it in certain light so that, that image shows up, or at least that's what I often do. So if you look at it from a different angle, it's just like tar smeared on a plate. That's all it, looks like aesthetically. So I think there's something interesting about that. And I found that the tar has these two sides to it that way. It has the hideous and also the beautiful about it. And so maybe that actually fits. But yeah, it's something that I definitely struggled with in terms of thinking about the aesthetic qualities and the dangers of aestheticizing. Bertinsky, is criticized for this often. So yeah, I was hoping that it wouldn't be quite so beautiful in that way, but also I think there are angles at which, it tells a different story. Thanks.
And another question coming.
Thank you very much for your talk and for sharing all of that. I appreciate it. This question is related for sure. About what I'm interpreting as a kind of affective dissonance in the story, because it seems like the mirror is showing her something ugly, as I think you're pointing out, because she's almost being forced to compare herself, as so many people are noticing cell phones are doing to them, as a kind of commodification of spirit and personhood. And yet Louis is smiling in this way that's the opposite of that dismay. And maybe she doesn't feel the dismay, but it could be dismay for someone who's forced into that commodification. And then I'm thinking about the deep time that you're recording and interpreting and the trajectory of the planet over that time. Is there an affective voice that speaks to you across deep time that carries that dissonance? I mean, does it tear you apart?
Yeah. There's a lot in that question. I think, you know, just in relation to the woman's response to her own image, I think, you know, she is also, I think, adopting a particular understanding of the self that, you know, her husband is maybe more obviously adopted, and I think she is also like judging her appearance on the basis of maybe imported European notions of beauty, right? And the idea of a Cree woman's you know, value in the community would not be based on a certain kind of appearance, right? So I think there's something going on there with how she sees herself, you know, ideologically in that space. But I think just in terms of your larger question about the affective dissonance and the sort of connections to deep time, yeah, I mean, I think there's, in a way, maybe this isn't really a coherent response to what you're saying, but I think there's a way that, you know, talking to some geologists who were mentioning that, you know, even with climate change, the Earth itself is not going to disappear. The biology will be fine, right? New things will happen. After an extinction event, you know, like the one 66 million years ago, 65 million years ago, all kinds of new life arose. So that, I guess, is a little bit of, I don't know, it doesn't make me feel much better, to be honest, but I mean, just the idea that, you know, life is not going to end, but we won't be here, and a whole lot of other kin that we have will not be here either. But I think this is also sort of things sort of connected to the question of despair and hope in our current moment, right? Recognizing the magnitude of what's happening to the Earth, recognizing humans' inability to get it together, to do something to change what they're doing is very difficult and disempowering. But I think for me, trying to find a new way of relating to the material maybe is a way we can, you know, at least begin to think about alternatives, to think about if you know, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, bitumen just was something you used to put in your canoe. To think maybe in 200 years, maybe bitumen will be something that you just put on your photograph. Maybe there is something of that sort of relational fluidity or flexibility that can give us a sense of empowerment and hope as well. But yeah, this is something I struggle with all the time, you know, and I think climate grief is something that is real, you know, it's something that we all have to make our way through to find a way that to maintain a kind of affective connection to one another and to our world, rather than just shutting down in the face of what those possibilities are. So I'm not sure that answered you. Thank you. A great question.
And yep, another.
Thank you, Warren. It's, as always, very inspiring and very stimulating. Two things, and they both relate to the last two questions. I'm a little confused about the mirror and the woman. If I may have not heard you right, but I thought you said when the husband looked in the image, he recognized himself. When she did, she saw the image of an ugly woman and she said, oh, great, he's not, you know, cheating with a nice woman. So she did not recognize herself. So that to me is very interesting and complicates things even more. It's a different kind of misrecognition.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the trapper, I guess, has been instructed in a certain way to view it. But I think, yes, I think I'm not quite sure what to make of the gendered implications of that, to be honest. And Louis tells the stories very much from a man's perspective, and he talks about how his teachings are men's teachings as well, and that there's a whole other world of women's teachings in Cree oral culture that he doesn't have access to. So maybe that would be a different answer if we asked a female elder.
May I?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what Louis does and what a lot of elders do is they'll do very much what the images here do is they multiply images and give different interpretations, possible interpretations. So the other part that maybe he's answering is exactly what the fur trade did to women's roles in society. Yeah. A la like Sylvia Van Kirk or yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So, and how Cree women's labor and contributions to the community changes, during the fur trade. I think that's a crucial point.
Thank you. Thank you both. My other point is, Alan talked about aesthetics. I have the privilege of having one of your photos that you gave me as a gift, and I'm very grateful for that. I have never managed to see myself mirrored in it. What I see is the golden color, and to me, it has the ability to render invisibility into something very complex. And my mother, I must say, she says, "Why do you have this here? It shows nothing." So while I was hearing you talking tonight, I was thinking of Jordan Abel's Poetics of Erasure, because I think that may be one compatible way or comparable way of understanding what happens in the image, that I know it's there, and I did see it a few times, but it's escaping me. It doesn't want to manifest itself. And so it has a different kind of, it compels you as a viewer, as a spectator, to have a different relationship with it. So I wonder whether you see any connection between what this bitumen does and what Jordan Abel does with his erasure poetics.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think basically viewing a petrograph has a huge, it depends on not only your own perspective, but on the space in which you are and the light. And so I've had this conversation with curators who looked at my images on the website, and then I send them for a show, and they're like, "Where is the image? It's not here." And I said, "Well, you need to move it around in the light." And so it's about location and about the kind of light. Say it's even daylight. In the window, if a certain light is coming through, then the image can be seen. So again, I think it's interesting in relation to thinking about the location of not just your own position as a viewer in relation to the artwork, but the larger space that it's in. But in relation to Jordan's work and the idea of taking a pre-existing text and finding something else in it. Often for Jordan, finding something that's almost contrary to the intentions of the original author. I think that's also interesting. That kind of for him, it's a writing practice, but it's a reading practice too. It's an interpretive practice. And I think when you're looking at a petrograph, you are trying to interpret, like to find where is the image. And I usually give titles that are quite prosaic and descriptive, so that I can give people a hint. It's like, see, this is in here somewhere. Because I want people to make that effort to find it, right? And again, this is an art, I guess, of finding the image in there. That in the 19th century, when daguerreotypes were the only kind of photograph that was circulating for the most part, they are mirrors like this too. And so everyone understood that a photograph was a mirror at that time. And so when the woman in the story mistakes the mirror for a photograph, it may be that she's just thinking it's a daguerreotype, right? But yeah, we've forgotten how to read images in this particular strange way. But for a while there, for about 30 years, 25 years, that was how photographs were to be interpreted. So yeah, I think it's very interesting how the practice of viewing, changes and shifts according to what materials we have to view.
We have another question here. There's language concepts filtering through here, but we may get to that, but yeah.
Thank you very much for your real engaging presentation, the humor, the depth, the wisdom. And as someone interested in photography, I also appreciated your comments about its evolution in terms of materials, process, methods, and you touched on it again right now on the daguerreotype. I'm a social scientist, and I want to step into that field for a second. A subtext of your presentation, because it wasn't the central focus, but then you used the term here, is you described the oil companies as a threat. And what I've noticed over the decades is that mining proceeded in this country without reference at all to indigenous peoples, although it affected them the most dramatically. But in the last 20 years, in the last quarter century, what we notice is that now no mining proceeds in the country without reference and often the required consent of indigenous peoples. So that's been a dramatic change. But within the indigenous community, what I'm noticing, and this was in yesterday's Globe and Mail on the front page of the Report on Business, and we've had many cases, we have differences and disagreements among indigenous peoples and nations about whether a project ought to proceed. Many in the indigenous communities and some look at it as an opportunity to advance economically, while others are worried about its ecological consequences. I wonder if you could elaborate there.
Yeah, this is a really difficult recent development. I say, yeah, as you say, 25 years, maybe 30 years that this has been the case. It's related to some certain Supreme Court decisions, and related to Indigenous nations, being more vocal about protecting their territory. But corporations have recognized that there are ways to, so as they would say, share the wealth. But as people who are opposed to those developments would say, they're dividing and conquering. And so it's that same process that colonization has utilized. But yeah, within our communities, there is disagreement about whether projects should go ahead or what the benefits might be. And now we have, in the Athabasca bitumen mines, the companies are, they're hiring indigenous people now, which is amazing. In the early part of when I started doing this work, most of the time, the communities right nearby, there's massive unemployment, even though people are flying from Newfoundland to work in these places. So some of the economic benefits are being felt in the communities, which is, I guess, a good thing. But at the same time, in a place like Fort McKay, their entire land base is utterly destroyed. So now they have no choice but to work in the tar sands because there's no other way to make a living there, essentially. So, and there's a lot of conflict within the community as to what should be done, either resisting or making better deals with the corporations. So I think this process is going to continue. I think communities are going to have a lot of difficult, tumultuous decisions to make, and they will not just be one-time decisions, but it will be ongoing. And so I think there are a lot of problems involved with that, but I think it's better than them not being consulted at all and being essentially erased from the situation when they have to deal with the environmental and cultural effects of these developments. But we'll see, I think, more and more corporations attempting to divide and conquer, to favor some parts of a community to try and get permission to do something. We see this in hydro work. This has been going on for decades already, and Manitoba Hydro has done this, where one community or one family even within a community gives certain favor, and then they create a vote so that that is approved for a certain project. So So yeah, I think Indigenous people have to be more and more aware of the forces that are attempting to manipulate and divide them. And when we are working together, it's much more difficult for these companies to do what they want to do. But yeah, this is a really, really powerful, important issue now for us. Thanks.
And that's pretty much the time we have for questions. Is there anything else you'd like to mention, or?
I see Larissa really wants to ask a quick question, but
Yeah, sure. Time.
Thank you, thank you. I have two quick comments and a question. So one of the things that's really striking me in relation to the work with Blake is that you're working with a kind of fearful symmetry. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that in Chinese earth traditions, we also use mirrors. They're used to, and they're also outward facing, and they're used to ward off bad spirits. So in case that's interesting. But my question for you is, thinking about the use of the tar to talk about tar extraction, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I'm hearing you develop a kind of, I would think of it as a kind of ethics of reflection. And if you can counterpose that perhaps to another ethics, which would be an ethics of excavation. So I'm really thinking as well about, all of the fossils. So I was really struck by that large, I'm sorry, I don't know what it was, but the prehistoric creature with the amazing scales. Mm-hmm. And from all the years of living in Calgary, I'm so conscious of all of the fossils that are kind of constantly tossed up through this excavation process, which tells us something about the deep past, which I find very interesting, but also it's troubling because of the way in which they're brought to light. So I'm wondering, if you could just kind of counterpose these two ethics, both of which produce things, but in very different kinds of ways.
Yeah. When I went out to gather the bitumen, I was, thinking about people from Métis community or from Cree communities or Dene communities who would have done this same thing, who would have gone out on the land to gather this material. And I asked around and I wasn't able to find anyone who had the teachings that were surrounded that, or, or at least no one was, willing to share that knowledge with me. But what I found was interesting, or I guess what I sort of developed as an ethic of excavation is that when I go to gather the bitumen, I also think of that as a reciprocal relationship. And so I'll bring an offering, usually sweetgrass, that I leave there where I take that tar, because I recognize I am taking something from the earth.
But you're also remaining on the surface, as a mirror is also kind of surface, as opposed to the oil companies, which are not.
That is really interesting development of the metaphor. Yeah. I'm not sure what to make of that, but thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a really fascinating, the surface depth idea in relation to our own position on the surface. And of course, all that deep time that is below us, right?
The reflectivity of surfaces.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's a great idea.
Turtles all the way down. And we're up to the next section. We have.
So this ends our programming for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for the thoughtful questions from the floor. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that there will be another lecture coming up at University College that you might be interested in. It will be held in January on the last day of the month, the 31st. It will be the Stubbs Lecture in English Literature, which will be given by Claire Petit from Cambridge University in the UK. Professor Petit is a specialist in the literary ideas of the 19th century. Her current work investigates the origins of the linked phenomena of structural racism, climate change, and nationalism. And her lecture will be held here. Stay tuned for the title and other details by consulting our website. The endowed lectures at the University College are fantastic opportunities, as you've heard tonight, to hear from renowned scholars talking about the things they are most passionate about. And I encourage you to come and hear the lectures in the coming months. Special thanks to Tyler for moderating, all the students, staff, and faculty involved in the planning of Professor Cariou's visit, Bonnie Wang for running the technology to allow the hybrid event to take place, and especially you, Warren. I don't think any of us will ever think about petroleum or bitumen with the same eyes ever again. For those of you here in person, I invite you to join us for a small reception just next door in our senior common room. Please stay and enjoy some food and drink with us. Thank you and good night.